She was running a food truck and gave a free meal to a broke culinary student. 1 year later, a millionaire appeared, and she was stunned when he said, "Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it." Clara Dawson wiped her hands on her apron, smudging flour across the already worn fabric, and stared out at the thin stream of customers scattered across the park. It was the middle of lunch hour, and yet, her food truck wasn't drawing the crowd she desperately needed. Just a few regulars picking up their usual orders, nothing that would put a dent in the growing stack of bills waiting on her kitchen counter back home. At 35, Clara had never imagined she'd be running a small food truck. She had spent years in culinary school, slaving away in the kitchens of upscale restaurants, dreaming of opening her own bistro someday. But reality had other plans. When the fine dining world proved too cutthroat, and investors dried up after a failed venture, Clara turned to the only thing left within her reach, a modest food truck that sold comfort food. She didn't mind working with simpler dishes. In fact, she enjoyed the challenge of elevating classic recipes. But these days, even those dishes weren't bringing in the business she needed. The bustling city had once been a place of opportunity, a place where food trucks like hers could thrive in the shadow of high-rises and tech startups. But things had changed. Trendy, Instagram-famous trucks with gimmicky menus, avocado ice cream, sushi burritos, gourmet donuts, were stealing the spotlight. Clara's truck, Clara's Comfort Kitchen, with its homely logo and classic offerings like meatloaf sandwiches, mac and cheese, and chicken pot pie, had faded into the background. She leaned against the truck's counter, her arms crossed, and watched as another sleek truck rolled into the park, immediately drawing a crowd. Neon lights flashed along its trim, and Clara caught a glimpse of its menu, rainbow-colored tacos served in blue corn tortillas. She sighed and pushed back from the counter, opening her truck's window a bit wider, hoping to catch someone's eye. A young woman walked by, eyeing the menu, but then hesitated. Clara gave her a hopeful smile. "Looking for something warm and filling? Best chicken pot pie in town." The woman smiled politely but shook her head. "Thanks, but I think I'll try those new rainbow tacos." Clara's smile faltered, but she nodded, watching the woman move toward the flashier option. She turned back inside the truck, her fingers brushing against the chipped edge of the menu board she'd hand-painted 2 years ago. The once bright colors had faded from exposure to the elements, just like her hopes for this business. Her truck had character, she knew that much. Clara had poured herself into it, staying up late at night perfecting her recipes, getting up at dawn to prep for the day. She'd saved every penny she could, skipping dinners, cutting corners where she could to keep the wheels turning. But the truck was starting to show its age. The paint was peeling in places, and the refrigerator sometimes made a troubling grinding noise that hinted at a costly repair she couldn't afford. Clara glanced down at her phone, checking the time. Nearly 2 p.m. Another slow day. And rent was due next week. She closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of exhaustion settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, though that was a part of it, the hours she spent on her feet, the early mornings, the late nights. It was the mental drain of constantly worrying about money, the anxiety that came with wondering if this would be the week everything fell apart. The day had dragged, the usual bustle of the lunch rush fading to the quiet hum of late afternoon. Clara leaned out of her food truck window, staring absently at the thinning foot traffic across the square. The sun was sinking behind the city's skyline, casting long shadows over the pavement. She sighed, wiping her hands on her apron, preparing to call it a day. It hadn't been a good one, not many customers, and certainly not enough to make a dent in the overdue payments weighing heavily on her mind. Just as she was about to close up, she saw him. A young man, probably in his early 20s, was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, staring at her truck as if he wasn't sure whether to approach or walk away. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair tousled, and there was a weariness in his eyes that Clara recognized instantly. He looked exhausted, hungry, but too proud to admit it. She watched him for a moment, waiting to see if he'd come closer. He hesitated, glancing at the menu posted on the side of the truck, then back at Clara. Finally, he shuffled forward, a worn backpack slung over his shoulder, his steps slow and deliberate. "Hey," he said softly, his voice tired but polite. You're still open, right?" Clara nodded, offering a warm smile. "Just about. What can I get you?" The young man glanced at the menu again, then down at his feet. I don't really have any money," he admitted quietly, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I've been walking around all day. I'm a culinary student, well, trying to be. But things are tight right now, and I ran out of cash for food. I can work for a meal, if you need help cleaning or something." Clara felt a pang of sympathy. She knew that struggle all too well. Culinary school was no easy feat, especially if you didn't have the means to support yourself outside of it. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the same desperation she'd felt years ago when she'd been a student just like him, scraping by, counting every penny, doing whatever it took to keep going. "You don't need to work," she said gently. "Let me fix you something." The young man blinked in surprise. "Really? I don't want to be a burden. I'm just really hungry." Clara waved off his concern. "You're not a burden. Everyone's got days like that." She turned to the stove, already moving with purpose. "What's your name?" "Luke," he answered after a pause. "Luke Ramirez." "Well, Luke, I'm Clara," she said over her shoulder as she began assembling one of her simpler dishes, a grilled cheese with a thick, buttery crust and a side of homemade tomato soup. "This won't take long." He stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do with himself. His eyes scanned the small truck, taking in the cramped, but neatly organized space. The scent of warm butter and melting cheese filled the air, and he couldn't help but lean in a little closer, his stomach growling despite his attempt to hide it. "I really appreciate this," he said after a moment. "It's been a rough few days. I'm still figuring things out. Culinary school's tough, and I thought I had it all under control, but..." Clara smiled to herself as she stirred the soup, ladling it into a small cup. She'd heard stories like his before. It was always the same, students with big dreams and even bigger obstacles. She'd lived that life for years, fighting to get through school, taking on extra jobs to pay for supplies, rent, food. She could still remember the exhaustion, the constant feeling that you were one step away from losing it all. "I get it," she said, turning back to hand him the plate. "We've all been there." Luke looked down at the food in his hands, his eyes wide with gratitude. "This smells amazing," he said softly, as if he couldn't quite believe his luck. "Eat up," Clara urged him, nodding toward the bench just across the way. "There's no rush." Luke hesitated for a second before walking over to the bench. He sat down carefully, as if he wasn't sure whether he deserved the comfort of the meal in front of him. Then, with a small nod to himself, he took the first bite of the sandwich. Clara watched him from the truck, leaning against the counter as the last of the day's light faded from the sky. She knew that feeling too, the mix of hunger and relief, the way a good meal could make everything feel just a little bit better, even if only for a moment. Watching Luke, she felt something lift inside her, a quiet satisfaction she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about feeding people. It was about giving them something to hold on to, something to remind them that they weren't alone. Luke finished the sandwich quickly, practically inhaling it, but he took his time with the soup, savoring each spoonful. When he finally finished, he stood up and walked back to the truck, holding the empty plate and cup as if they were delicate treasures. That was amazing," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Clara replied, taking the plate and cup from him with a smile. Just pay it forward someday. I will, Luke said quickly. I swear, I will. Once I get my degree and get a job, I'll make sure I pay you back somehow. I won't forget this. Clara nodded, though she didn't expect to see him again. People came and went, and promises like that often faded with time. But something about Luke's sincerity made her pause. Maybe he was different. Maybe he would remember. I'm sure you'll do just fine, she said with a smile. Just keep going. Don't give up on yourself. Luke nodded, his expression serious. I won't. And thank you again. You've helped more than you know. With that, he turned and walked back into the city, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians as the evening settled in. Clara stood there for a moment, watching him go, before turning back to her empty truck. The park was quiet now, the buzz of the day fading into the hum of streetlights and distant traffic. Clara hadn't expected to see Luke again, but life had a way of throwing surprises at you when you least expected them. The next day, just before the lunch rush, he returned. His clothes were the same, his backpack slung over one shoulder, but this time his face held something different, a determination, as if he'd spent the night thinking over what had happened and arrived at a decision. Hey, Luke said, standing at the window of her truck, hands shoved into his pockets. His voice was still soft, but clearer now, less worn down than the previous day. Hey, yourself, Clara replied, already smiling. How'd it go? You get some rest? Yeah, a little, he admitted. I wanted to come back and, see if you need any help. I could wash dishes or clean tables, whatever you need. I can't take more food without doing something in return. It doesn't feel right. Clara glanced around at the truck, the little space she'd meticulously organized over the years. There wasn't much for Luke to do, but the sincerity in his offer tugged at her. She could see how much it bothered him to accept something for nothing, the way his shoulders stiffened as he spoke. She'd been there once, hell, she was still there in a lot of ways, knowing the taste of helplessness, but feeling too proud to admit it. I appreciate the offer, she said, leaning on the counter, but you don't owe me anything, Luke. Not yesterday's meal, not today's. I've been where you are. It's a tough place, and sometimes the hardest thing to do is let someone help you. But trust me, it's the least I can do. Luke opened his mouth, ready to argue, but Clara held up a hand. Let me guess, she continued, her voice teasing but warm, you've always taken care of yourself, right? Maybe even other people. And now, suddenly, things are out of your control, and that feels unbearable. You think you need to repay every act of kindness, because if you don't, it's like admitting defeat. His silence was all the confirmation she needed. Clara nodded, her eyes softening. Look, I don't need you to wash dishes. What I need is for you to eat, get back on your feet, and chase whatever dream brought you to culinary school in the first place. Luke's shoulders sagged slightly, the tension bleeding out of him, replaced by something that looked like relief. I don't want to take advantage of you. You've already done more than enough. I'm not worried, Clara said, and before he could protest again, she turned to the small fridge, pulling out a couple of containers. She packed them carefully, making sure they were filled to the brim with enough food to last him a couple of days, leftover mac and cheese, some roasted vegetables, and a chicken casserole she had made earlier in the week. It wasn't fancy, but it was hearty and filling. You're going to take this, she said, handing him the bag, and you're not going to feel bad about it. Got it? Luke stared down at the bag in his hands, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Clara, Nope, she interrupted with a playful shake of her head. Don't you dare thank me again. Just promise me you'll keep going. You don't need to pay me back. Someday, when you're in a better place, you'll see someone else who needs help, and you'll do the same. That's how it works. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the bag. For a moment, Clara thought he might argue again, insist on doing something in return. But then, his shoulders relaxed, and he gave her a small, grateful nod. "I promise," he said softly. "I'll pay it forward." Clara smiled, feeling the knot of tension in her own chest loosen. She hadn't done much, not really. A few meals, a few kind words. But she knew how much that could mean when you were at the end of your rope, when the world seemed to be caving in around you. Sometimes, even the smallest acts could feel like lifelines. "Good," she said, leaning back against the counter. "Now, get going before the lunch crowd shows up. You don't want to see how crazy it gets around here." With one last smile, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of office workers and tourists that had begun to fill the square. Clara watched him go, a strange mix of emotions stirring inside her. She didn't expect to see him again. Life in the city was like that. People came and went, and sometimes they faded from your memory like ghosts, leaving only a faint imprint behind. The year had passed like a slow-moving storm, dark clouds gathering and refusing to break. Clara could feel it in every corner of her life, the weight of impending disaster. Business had dried up more than she ever expected. Larger food trucks with flashy gimmicks and endless marketing budgets had moved in, taking over the popular spots. Their menus sparkled with trendy, overpriced fare, and the crowds flocked to them, snapping photos of their rainbow-colored bowls and avocado toasts. Meanwhile, Clara's modest, no-frills comfort food truck sat empty far too often. Her mac and cheese, once the talk of the park, now seemed like an afterthought. There were days when she'd serve fewer than 10 people, barely enough to cover the cost of ingredients, let alone rent and the mounting pile of overdue bills. Her food truck, Clara's Comfort Kitchen, had been her pride and joy, the symbol of her resilience after her restaurant dreams had crumbled years before. She had fought to keep it going, scraping by, holding on to hope. But lately, hope felt like something distant, an old friend who had long since moved away and forgotten to call. On a cold Monday afternoon, Clara stood behind the truck's small counter, staring out at the nearly empty park. The wind bit through her coat, and she tugged it tighter around herself, though it did little to ward off the chill creeping into her bones. 2 customers sat at a bench nearby, sipping coffee from somewhere else, not even glancing at her truck. They'd walked right by her earlier, uninterested, despite the mouth-watering smells that filled the air. Clara sighed and leaned against the counter, her eyes scanning the distant skyline. Every corner of the city felt the same, too fast, too big, too competitive. There was no room for someone like her, someone who wanted to serve up simple, heartfelt meals. People wanted spectacle now, not sustenance. The realization sat heavy in her chest, a slow, sinking weight she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting her thoughts. She picked it up and immediately regretted it. Another message from her landlord about the overdue rent on her apartment. He was getting less patient with every passing week, and she couldn't blame him. She was 2 months behind and had barely made a dent in the rent for the truck's parking space. Something had to give soon. Clara's mind wandered, as it often did these days, to a possibility she had been resisting for months, giving up the food truck and taking a job in someone else's kitchen. The thought made her stomach twist with dread. She'd worked in restaurants for years, working her way up from dishwasher to line cook to sous chef. It was grueling work, long hours in the heat of a kitchen, the constant pressure, the yelling, the endless cycle of prepping, cooking, and cleaning. She didn't want to go back to that life, didn't want to lose the freedom she'd fought so hard to create for herself. But with each passing day, it seemed like there was no other option. A steady paycheck, even as a line cook, would at least keep a roof over her head and food on her table. She'd have to swallow her pride. She could hear the voice of her mentor from years ago, reminding her that sometimes survival meant making sacrifices. But how much more was she willing to sacrifice? The familiar grinding sound of her truck's refrigerator snapped her out of her thoughts. It had been acting up for weeks, and she hadn't had the cash to get it fixed. Each time it made that noise, Clara felt a pang of fear. What if it broke down completely? She couldn't afford to replace it, not now. And if it went, so did the food truck. Another problem she couldn't afford to solve. She grabbed a rag and wiped down the counters, more out of habit than necessity. The truck was spotless. There was no one to make a mess in it. A gust of wind blew through the park, rattling the metal sign outside her truck. The weather was turning colder, and with the winter months approaching, things would only get worse. Fewer people would venture out into the chill for lunch from a food truck. It had been hard enough during the summer, when business was supposed to be booming. Now, she dreaded the idea of facing long, bitterly cold days with no customers in sight. The truck's radio crackled to life, pulling her attention to the familiar voice of a local DJ, his smooth baritone spilling out into the small space. And now, a little something to warm you up on this chilly afternoon. Here's Billie Holiday with I'll Be Seeing You. The melancholy tune filled the air, and Clara let herself sink into the music for a moment, her hands still on the rag, frozen mid-wipe. She hadn't realized how exhausted she was until that moment, standing there in the stillness of her truck. The constant stress, the worry that gnawed at her day and night, had worn her down to the bone. Maybe it was time to let go. Maybe it was time to admit that the truck had run its course, that she couldn't keep up with the changing tides. The thought was unbearable, but what other choice did she have? She could apply for jobs at the bigger restaurants downtown, reach out to old contacts, maybe even land a spot at a high-end place where she could disappear into the background as another faceless line cook. Clara rubbed her hands together, trying to warm them against the cold air sneaking into the truck. The park was almost empty now, and the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the pavement. She sighed and started closing up for the day, methodically shutting off the burners, packing away the food she hadn't sold. Her hands moved on autopilot, her mind elsewhere, spinning in endless loops of worry. As she pulled down the window and locked the door, she glanced at her phone again. The rent reminder glared back at her. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it all pressing in on her, suffocating in its certainty. There was no avoiding it any longer. She would have to make a choice soon. Either find a way to keep the truck afloat, or give up the dream she had clung to for so long. The thought of letting go was painful, but sometimes life didn't give you any other option. Clara locked up the truck and started walking home, her footsteps heavy against the concrete. The music from the radio played on in her mind, haunting her as the city lights flickered to life around her. The wind had picked up that evening, swirling dust around the park as Clara closed up her truck. The day had been as slow as any in recent months, and the familiar pang of disappointment settled deep in her chest. She wiped down the counters with tired hands, the repetitive motion a brief respite from the flood of worries constantly circling her mind. Bills. Rent. Repairs. And now the added weight of looming winter, when business would all but disappear. The walls felt like they were closing in a little more every day, and Clara wasn't sure how much longer she could hold them at bay. She was just about to lock up when she heard the low hum of an engine, followed by the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. Clara glanced up, expecting to see one of the regulars, maybe someone who had forgotten to grab dinner on their way home. But what rolled up next was anything but regular. A sleek, black SUV, shiny and pristine, pulled to a stop in front of her truck. The headlights cut through the early evening gloom, and for a moment, Clara stood frozen, the rag still in her hand. The door swung open with an easy confidence, and a man stepped out, tall and sharply dressed in a dark suit that seemed too polished for the worn-down park she occupied. For a split second, Clara's stomach lurched with a familiar fear. Creditors, maybe? Someone coming to collect what little she had left. But then the man turned, and her breath caught in her throat. She knew that face, even if it had changed in subtle ways over the past year. The same boyish features, the same brown eyes, though now there was a new spark of confidence behind them. Luke? Her voice was more of a question than a statement, as if she wasn't entirely sure her memory was working properly. Luke smiled, wide and easy, as he walked toward the truck. Clara, he said, his voice warm. It's been a while. She blinked, trying to reconcile the person standing in front of her with the disheveled, hungry young man she had fed on a whim 1 year ago. Yeah, she managed to say, though her mind was still reeling. It has. Luke stopped just short of the counter, glancing around at the truck with a soft smile, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like nostalgia. I've been meaning to come by, he said, but things got crazy for a while. I'm sorry it took so long. Clara shook her head, still grappling with the sight of him, so polished, so put together. It's fine, she said slowly. I wasn't expecting this. You look different. Luke chuckled, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. I guess a lot's changed. More than I could have imagined, really. Clara put the rag down, leaning on the counter. So, what happened? Last I saw you, you were barely scraping by? Luke finished for her, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yeah. Well, after you gave me that meal, something clicked. I guess I realized that I had to stop waiting for life to turn around and start making it happen for myself. Clara raised an eyebrow. That meal did all that? Luke laughed, a genuine sound that made her smile despite her confusion. No, not just the meal. But what you did, it meant something. You didn't know me, and you gave me food when I had nothing. It reminded me that there are people who care. And that if I wanted to pay that kindness back, I had to get serious. He leaned against the counter now, his posture easy, as if he had all the time in the world to tell his story. I started working harder at school, but I also got this idea. I loved food, always had, and I wanted to share that love with the world. So, I started a food blog. At first, it was just me talking about dishes I'd learned in school or places I'd visited. But then, somehow, it started gaining traction. Clara listened, her curiosity piqued. Gaining traction? Like, people started reading it? Yeah, Luke nodded. I think it was a mix of being in the right place at the right time. I started reviewing restaurants, showcasing recipes, and then, bam. It took off. Before I knew it, I was getting sponsorships, then bigger deals. It all happened so fast. Clara shook her head in amazement. That's incredible. It's been a wild ride, Luke admitted, his expression turning more serious. And the craziest part? That little blog is what helped me open my first restaurant. Clara blinked, her mouth hanging open for a second. Wait, you own a restaurant? Not just one, Luke said with a grin. I own a few now. High-end places. And I've got a great team running them, but it all started with that blog. The same one that your food inspired me to create. Clara could barely process what he was saying. A year ago, Luke had been a broke culinary student, struggling just to get by. Now, he was standing in front of her in a designer suit, talking about owning multiple restaurants, like it was no big deal. That's unbelievable, she finally said, her voice soft. Luke's expression softened. I owe you a lot, Clara. More than I can ever repay. You helped me when no one else did. I wouldn't be here without you. Clara waved her hand, brushing off his words. I just gave you a meal, Luke. That's hardly. No, Luke said firmly, stepping forward. It was more than that. You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. You made me feel like I could keep going. And now, I'm here because of that. Because of you. Clara felt her throat tighten, the unexpected emotion creeping in. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words, how much she needed to know that something good had come from all her struggles. But now, Luke continued, his eyes bright, I want to help you. The way you helped me. Clara blinked, unsure of what he meant. Help me? Luke smiled. I know things have been tough for you, and I've got some ideas. I want to invest in your truck, Clara. Help you expand, grow, whatever you want to do. I've got the resources now, and I want to use them to pay back the kindness you showed me. Clara's breath caught in her chest. She hadn't expected this. Not even close. Luke, she paused, struggling to find the right words. I don't even know what to say. Just say yes, Luke said softly. Let me help you, Clara. You deserve it. The streetlights had flickered on, casting a soft glow over the park as Clara stood frozen in front of her food truck. Luke's offer hung in the air, heavy and unreal. He wanted to invest in her business, to help her expand, to turn her small, struggling food truck into something she'd never imagined, a franchise. She hadn't expected this. Not when he pulled up in that sleek SUV, and certainly not when he'd started talking about how much that meal a year ago had meant to him. She'd thought he was here to say thank you, maybe buy another meal, or at most, offer her some advice from someone who'd made it in the culinary world. But this? This was beyond anything she could have dreamed. Clara stared at him, trying to find her voice. Luke, this is... crazy? Luke finished for her with a grin. Maybe. But it's real. Clara shook her head, her mind racing. Expand? Franchise? She'd barely been keeping her head above water as it was. The idea of taking on more, of growing, of turning her single food truck into something bigger, it was exciting, yes, but it was terrifying too. You don't have to say yes right now, Luke added, as if sensing the whirlwind of thoughts she was caught in. I know it's a lot. But I've been thinking about this for a while, ever since things started taking off for me. I wanted to find a way to give back, and you're the first person I thought of. You gave me a chance, Clara. I wouldn't be here without you. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight. It's not that I'm not grateful, Luke. I am. I just don't know if I'm ready for something like that. Expanding, it's a huge step. Luke nodded, his expression serious now. I get it. I really do. But think about this, you've built something amazing here. People love your food. I know it's been tough lately, but that doesn't mean your business can't succeed. With the right support, with the resources I have now, you could take this food truck and make it into something bigger. Something that reaches more people. He paused, meeting her eyes. I know it's scary. But you've been doing this on your own for so long. Imagine what you could do with a partner. Someone who believes in you as much as you believed in me. Clara wanted to believe him. She wanted to see the potential that he saw in her business, in herself. But after so many months of struggling, it was hard to imagine anything other than scraping by, just trying to make it to the next day. The idea of taking a risk, of betting on herself again after so many failures, felt overwhelming. I don't know, she said, her voice quieter now. What if I mess it up? What if it all goes wrong? Luke smiled, a soft, understanding smile. Then we figure it out. Together. You're not in this alone, Clara. That's the whole point. You don't have to do it by yourself anymore. The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at her with such faith, it made something inside her shift. She had spent so long trying to carry everything on her own shoulders. Every failure, every setback, every missed opportunity had felt like it was hers alone to bear. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do that anymore. Clara glanced around at her truck, at the place she had poured her heart and soul into. The truck was tired, its paint chipped and its equipment worn, but it had been her refuge. Her last stand. Letting it grow, expanding beyond the small, familiar world, it felt like stepping into the unknown. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. What exactly are you offering? She asked, her voice steadying as she began to entertain the idea. How would this work? Luke's eyes lit up with excitement, as if he'd been waiting for her to ask. We start small. I don't want to overwhelm you. Maybe one or two more trucks to begin with, in other parts of the city. We get a team in place to help manage them, so you're not doing everything on your own. We'll upgrade your current truck, give it a facelift, new equipment, whatever you need to make things easier. And from there, we'll see where it goes. Clara hesitated again, still processing the enormity of it all. You're sure about this? You're really willing to invest in my little food truck business? Luke leaned forward, resting his hands on the counter between them, his expression sincere. Clara, I owe you more than I can ever repay. You gave me a chance when I had nothing. You saw something in me when I couldn't even see it in myself. This isn't just about money for me, it's about giving you the same opportunity you gave me. I want to see you succeed. And I know you can. She felt her chest tighten again, this time with emotion instead of fear. No one had ever believed in her like this. Not since her first attempt at opening a restaurant, when investors had backed out, leaving her dream to wither on the vine. But here was Luke, offering her a second chance, not just with words, but with action. I don't know what to say, she whispered, feeling the weight of his offer settle over her. Luke smiled again, that warm, easy smile that made her feel like she wasn't alone anymore. Just say yes. Take the chance, Clara. You've earned it. Clara stared at him for a long moment, the noise of the city fading into the background as the possibilities stretched out in front of her. It was a risk, no doubt about that. But it was also a lifeline, one she hadn't expected but desperately needed. Finally, she let out a slow breath and nodded. Okay, she said, her voice stronger now. Let's do it. Luke's grin was immediate, wide and full of excitement. You won't regret it, he promised, straightening up. I'll start working on the details. We'll take this one step at a time. Clara never thought she'd see the day when her food truck would evolve into a fleet. Yet here she was, standing in front of Clara's comfort kitchen, not just one, but 3 trucks now gleaming under the city's hazy morning sun. The new trucks had the same logo she had painted years ago, only now it was slicker, professionally designed, with bright lettering and a color scheme that popped in the bustling streets of the city. The trucks were fully equipped with brand new kitchens, polished surfaces, and the kind of organization she'd only dreamed of when it was just her, working alone in a worn-out vehicle. Luke had been true to his word. Step by step, they'd expanded, first one more truck, then another. The demand had come faster than Clara anticipated, the city seemingly unable to get enough of her signature comfort food. The addition of the new locations had opened doors she hadn't even thought to knock on. And it wasn't just her menu that had people coming back, it was the story behind it, the idea of homemade meals, honest cooking in a world that had gone too fast, too processed. Clara hadn't felt this sense of stability, of control, in years. The fear that had clung to her for so long, the constant worry that the bottom might fall out at any moment, was finally starting to loosen its grip. She had a cushion now, not just a financial one, but a mental one too. Business was booming, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. And it wasn't just her. Clara stood by the truck, her eyes scanning the park, where the lunchtime crowd was beginning to gather. She spotted Mia at the second truck, chatting animatedly with a customer while prepping orders at lightning speed. Mia had come to her, much like Clara had once been, tired, hungry, and struggling to keep her culinary dreams alive. She'd been working long shifts at a failing diner before Clara had offered her a job, and now, Mia was the one running the second truck, smiling and laughing like she'd found her place. At the third truck, parked further down the street, Marcus was holding things down. He was a little older than Clara, a chef who'd spent years in high-end kitchens, but had lost his job when his restaurant had downsized. The day Marcus came to Clara, with his gruff voice and his unshakable pride, he'd tried to turn down her offer. But he'd come around, and now, he was running the third truck with the kind of efficiency that only someone who had been through the ringer in the restaurant world could manage. Seeing them there, working with the same passion she had for this business, filled Clara with a quiet sense of pride. She wasn't just building a business anymore, she was building a team. She had people she trusted, chefs who understood what it was like to be on the edge, struggling, but still holding on to the love of food that had brought them to this life. Clara leaned against the counter of her truck, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingertips. The smell of fresh biscuits and bacon wafted up from the grill inside, and she smiled. This was hers. And now, with the weight of running it alone lifted, she had time to think, time to breathe, time to enjoy what she had worked so hard to create. Luke had been right. He'd promised she wouldn't regret taking the leap, and she didn't. Every step of the way, he had been there, supportive, but not overbearing. He'd let her make the decisions, shape the expansion to fit her vision, and she respected him even more for that. Luke wasn't just an investor, he was a partner, someone who understood her need for control, but also her need for growth. The expansion had taken off faster than either of them had anticipated. It wasn't long before other neighborhoods were calling for Clara's comfort kitchen, and soon, they were exploring the idea of more trucks, venturing into other parts of the city. The success was thrilling, but more than that, it was humbling. Clara knew how quickly things could turn, how fragile this world could be. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had a plan, a support system, and a business that was flourishing. As the crowd grew and the lunch rush began in earnest, Clara moved back into the truck, sliding into her familiar rhythm. The orders came fast, but she was faster, hands moving with the kind of muscle memory she'd built from years of doing this. She could hear Mia and Marcus calling out orders from their trucks, their voices full of energy, and it made her heart swell. "You've got a great thing going here," a voice interrupted her thoughts, and Clara turned to see a customer standing at the window, grinning. "I've been coming by since you had just one truck. It's amazing to see how far you've come." Clara smiled, handing him his sandwich. "Thanks. It's been quite the journey." The man nodded, tipping his cap before stepping away, and Clara couldn't help but feel a small burst of pride. She had come far. Further than she ever thought possible. And now, with these trucks, with her team, she was only just beginning. As the day wore on, the lunch crowd began to thin, and Clara finally had a moment to breathe. She stepped outside, taking in the sight of her trucks, her team, her business running like a well-oiled machine. It still felt surreal, this success. After years of fighting to stay afloat, after countless days of wondering whether she'd have to give it all up, she was standing here, on solid ground, with a future that looked brighter than it ever had. She thought of Luke, and the way he'd believed in her when she'd been so close to giving up. Without him, none of this would have been possible. But it wasn't just his money that had saved her, it was his faith in her, his belief that she could do more than just survive. And now, she was proving him right. Mia waved at her from the second truck, and Clara waved back, a small smile tugging at her lips. She had a lot to be grateful for. And as she looked at the trucks, her trucks, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Contentment. The sound of sizzling bacon and the steady hum of conversation filled the air as Clara worked through another busy lunch rush. Business had never been better. The trucks were thriving, the customers were loyal, and for the first time in years, Clara felt like she was truly building something that would last. She had finally found her rhythm, and it seemed like nothing could knock her off balance. But as the day wound down and the crowds began to thin, Clara's phone buzzed. She wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the screen. It was an email from one of her regular customers, an attorney who had a habit of keeping her in the loop about any city news that might affect her business. The subject line read, "Urgent, City Council's new ordinance on food trucks." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She opened the email, skimming over the formal language until her eyes landed on the part that made her stomach drop. The city council was proposing a new ordinance that would restrict food trucks from operating in the most profitable areas of downtown, citing issues of overcrowding and complaints from brick-and-mortar restaurant owners. They wanted to move the trucks to designated zones, far from the bustling offices and foot traffic that had made the food truck industry so successful. Clara blinked, reading the email again just to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. But the words didn't change. The new law threatened to push her trucks, and others like them, into obscure corners of the city where business would be minimal. For a moment, Clara felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. She'd worked so hard to get to this point. The trucks were thriving, and she had hired people who depended on these jobs, Mia, Marcus, and the others who had come to rely on Clara's comfort kitchen as a source of stability. This new law would be devastating, not just for her, but for the entire food truck community. "Clara, you okay?" Mia's voice broke through the fog of worry. Clara looked up, realizing her grip on the phone had tightened to the point of discomfort. She forced a smile and shook her head. "Yeah. Just a little distracted." Mia raised an eyebrow but didn't push. The last few weeks had been nothing but good news, business booming, the team growing, everything finally falling into place. But Clara knew that was about to change, and the weight of that realization pressed heavily on her chest. As the day came to a close and the last customers wandered off, Clara gathered her crew together. Mia, Marcus, and the others stood by the trucks, their faces curious and concerned as Clara explained what she had learned. "They're calling it a zoning ordinance," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The city council wants to ban food trucks from downtown. They say it's because of overcrowding and complaints from restaurants." Mia frowned. "But that's where we get the most business. How are we supposed to survive if they push us out of the prime spots?" "That's the problem," Clara said, her frustration seeping into her words. "If this passes, we'll be forced into areas where foot traffic is almost non-existent. It's going to kill our business." Marcus crossed his arms, his face hardening. "This sounds like a play by the big restaurants. They've been complaining about us for years, saying we're cutting into their profits. But we're not the ones charging $20 for a sandwich." Clara nodded. She'd heard the grumblings from brick-and-mortar owners before, but she'd never imagined it would come to this. "We need to figure out a way to fight this. If we don't, it won't just be us, every food truck in the city will be in trouble." Mia glanced around at the others. "How do we fight the city council?" "We get organized," Clara said, feeling a flicker of determination. "We rally the other food trucks, the customers, anyone who will listen. We show the council that this isn't just about a few complaints. This is about people's livelihoods." Marcus nodded. "I'm in. Whatever it takes." The others chimed in, echoing their agreement. Clara felt a surge of hope. They were a small team, but they weren't powerless. They had built something strong, something worth fighting for. The next few days were a blur of meetings and phone calls. Clara reached out to every food truck owner she knew, explaining the threat they all faced. Together, they formed a coalition, pooling their resources and strategizing ways to stop the ordinance from passing. They started with petitions, gathering signatures from customers who loved their food and supported their right to operate downtown. Clara was amazed at how quickly the signatures piled up. People didn't just want the convenience of food trucks, they wanted the sense of community they brought, the connection to small business owners who poured their hearts into every meal. Social media exploded with posts about the ordinance, with customers sharing stories of their favorite food trucks and why they didn't want to see them disappear from the heart of the city. Local news outlets picked up the story, interviewing food truck owners and highlighting the impact the new law would have on the industry. But as the day of the city council meeting approached, Clara knew the fight was far from over. They had the public on their side, but the restaurants had money, influence, and a louder voice in the political sphere. The morning of the meeting, Clara stood outside City Hall, surrounded by food truck owners, employees, and customers. Mia and Marcus flanked her, holding signs that read, "Save our trucks" and "Support small business." The air was thick with tension as they waited for the council to begin. Clara glanced around at the faces in the crowd, people she had fed, people who had come to depend on her business as a part of their daily routine. She had built something meaningful, not just for herself, but for her team and her community. And she wasn't about to let it be taken away without a fight. The doors to City Hall opened, and Clara felt her stomach tighten. This was it. The moment that would decide the future of Clara's comfort kitchen and the livelihood of so many others. "Let's do this," she said, squaring her shoulders as she led the way inside. Clara stood in front of the makeshift podium outside City Hall, the sharp chill of the morning air biting through her jacket. The crowd had already gathered, food truck owners, employees, and loyal customers alike, filling the plaza with signs, banners, and voices full of determination. The air buzzed with a sense of urgency, the collective energy rising as more people streamed in, holding signs that read, "Save our trucks," and "Food trucks are small business." Beside her, Luke stood with his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the growing crowd. He'd been her rock through this whole ordeal, helping her rally the city's food truck community and navigate the bureaucratic nightmare the city council had thrown their way. His calm, steady presence gave her the strength to face the uphill battle they were fighting. "You ready for this?" Luke asked, turning to her with a small smile. Clara nodded, though the knot of nerves in her stomach said otherwise. "As ready as I'll ever be. We've done everything we can to make our case. Just remember," Luke said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "you're not alone in this. We've got the numbers. We've got the people. We just need to make them listen." Clara took a deep breath and let her eyes sweep across the crowd. It wasn't just food truck owners who had shown up today, it was their customers, the people who loved the convenience, the variety, the sense of community that the food trucks brought to the city. Office workers, students, families with children, all of them were here because they didn't want to lose something that had become a part of their daily lives. The council members had painted food trucks as a nuisance, a problem to be dealt with. But Clara knew better. Food trucks were more than just mobile kitchens, they were symbols of entrepreneurship, of resilience. They were the little guys in a city dominated by big corporations and fancy restaurants. And she wasn't about to let them be pushed out without a fight. As the crowd quieted, Clara stepped up to the podium, the cold metal of the microphone sending a shiver down her spine. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed the nerves aside. This wasn't about her. It was about all of them, the people who had built their livelihoods around these trucks, the people who depended on them. "Thank you all for being here," Clara began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "We're here today because the city council is trying to take away something that belongs to all of us. They want to push our trucks out of the most profitable areas, claiming it's about overcrowding, claiming it's about complaints from restaurants. But we all know the truth, this isn't about complaints. This is about small businesses being pushed aside to make way for the big players." There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd, and Clara's confidence grew. She looked out over the sea of faces. Mia and Marcus were there, standing proudly with their team, their signs held high. Other truck owners had joined them, people she'd met only recently but who had become allies in this fight. They were all in this together. "We're not just food trucks," Clara continued, her voice rising with passion. "We're people. We're small business owners who have worked hard to build something from the ground up. We provide jobs, we provide affordable food to the people of this city, and we bring something unique to the streets. We belong here just as much as anyone else." The crowd erupted in cheers, the noise echoing off the tall buildings around them. Clara could feel the momentum building, the energy swelling as more people gathered to listen. This was the kind of support they needed, the kind of attention that the city council couldn't ignore. "We've gathered thousands of signatures," Clara said, holding up the thick stack of petitions they had collected over the past few weeks. "Thousands of people who want to keep food trucks in their neighborhoods, who understand that we're an integral part of this city's culture and economy. This isn't just about us, it's about the people we serve." Luke stepped forward, taking the petitions from Clara's hand and raising them high for the crowd to see. "We're not going to back down," he called out, his voice ringing with authority. "We're going to keep fighting until the city council realizes that pushing out food trucks isn't just bad for us, it's bad for the city." The cheers grew louder, the crowd chanting now. "Save our trucks! Save our trucks!" Clara stepped back, letting Luke take the lead for a moment. She couldn't help but feel a surge of pride at how far they had come. Luke had been instrumental in mobilizing the community, using his connections and resources to get the word out. But it was the people who had shown up, the customers who had signed petitions, who had written letters, who had taken to social media to spread the word, who had made the biggest difference. After weeks of gathering signatures, attending community meetings, and rallying support from the public, they were finally here. The city council couldn't ignore them now. The petitions, the media attention, the sheer number of people standing outside City Hall, it all painted a picture that was impossible to dismiss. As the rally continued, Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped away from the podium and glanced at the screen. It was a text from the attorney who had first tipped her off about the ordinance. "Council meeting starting now. They'll be discussing the ordinance in a few minutes." Clara's stomach flipped. This was it, the moment they had been working toward. She turned to Luke, who was still addressing the crowd, and nodded. "It's time." Luke stepped down from the podium, giving her a reassuring smile. "We've done all we can. Now we go in there and make them listen." Together, they walked toward the entrance of City Hall, flanked by a few other food truck owners who had become the de facto leaders of the coalition. Inside, the atmosphere was more subdued, the stark contrast to the noisy energy outside almost jarring. Council members sat in their high-backed chairs, their expressions serious, as the meeting was called to order. Clara and the others took their seats in the gallery, waiting as the agenda items were discussed one by one. It felt like hours before the food truck ordinance finally came up, but when it did, Clara sat up straighter, her heart pounding in her chest. The council chairperson cleared his throat and began to speak. Next on the agenda, proposed Ordinance 47B, concerning the restriction of mobile food vendors in downtown areas. Clara's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment that would determine the future of Clara's comfort kitchen and every other truck like hers. The council would debate, they would vote, and all she could do was hope that their voices, the voices of the people, had been loud enough to make a difference. Clara sat in the gallery, the tension in the room so thick it was almost suffocating. The air was cool, but her palms were slick with sweat, her heart beating a little too fast for comfort. She cast a glance at Luke, sitting beside her, his posture calm but alert, like he was ready for whatever was about to come next. His presence was reassuring, a quiet anchor in the chaos that had consumed the past few weeks of their lives. The council members were huddled together in their seats, discussing the ordinance that would decide the future of her business, the future of the entire food truck community. Clara could feel every second stretching out, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. It had been a long road to get here, weeks of rallies, petitions, public outcry, but now, it all boiled down to this vote. One decision, and it could all be over, for better or worse. The council chairperson, an older man with thinning hair and a weary expression, cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. After much discussion, he began, his voice even, "The council has agreed to amend the proposed ordinance. Instead of banning food trucks from the downtown areas entirely, we will establish designated zones for mobile vendors. These zones will allow for regulated operation while addressing the concerns raised by local restaurants and business owners." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. Designated zones. Not a ban. It wasn't perfect, but it was a victory, one that would keep her trucks running and her team employed. "The motion has passed," the chairperson continued. "Effective immediately, the food truck ban is no longer under consideration." The words settled over the room like a wave of relief, and Clara had to take a moment to let them sink in. No ban. They had done it. She turned to Luke, her eyes wide with disbelief, but he was already grinning, his hand reaching for hers in a gesture of quiet triumph. "We did it," he whispered, his voice low but filled with pride. Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "We really did." As the council adjourned, Clara stood, her legs a little shaky but her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Around her, the other food truck owners exchanged hugs and handshakes, their smiles wide and full of relief. The fight had been hard, but they had come out on top. They hadn't let the city push them aside. They hadn't let anyone tell them they didn't belong. Mia rushed over, practically bouncing with excitement. "Can you believe it?" she exclaimed, her eyes shining. "No, Ban. We're still in business." Clara laughed, the tension finally draining from her body. "I can believe it. And I'm so proud of us." Marcus joined them, his usually serious face softened by a rare smile. "We fought back. They hurt us." Clara looked around at the people who had stood by her, who had fought beside her, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This victory wasn't just hers, it belonged to all of them. The food truck community had come together, had made their voices heard, and now, they had a future. As they made their way out of City Hall and into the chilly afternoon air, Clara was greeted by the sight of the rally still in full swing outside. When the crowd saw her, a cheer went up, the sound of it reverberating through the plaza. It was almost overwhelming, the support, the solidarity, but Clara welcomed it, let it wash over her like a warm tide. These were the people who had made this possible, and she would never forget it. Luke stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder as they watched the celebration unfold. "This is just the beginning," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet confidence. Clara turned to him, her eyes bright. "I know. And I'm ready." In the days that followed, Clara's business didn't just survive, it thrived. The media attention from the council's decision had brought new customers to her trucks, curious to see what all the fuss had been about. Clara's Comfort Kitchen had become more than just a food truck chain, it had become a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what you believed in. As demand grew, so did the business. Clara expanded her fleet, adding 2 more trucks to cover new areas of the city. The designated zones, though not perfect, provided plenty of opportunity for growth, and Clara took full advantage of it. With Luke's continued support, she hired more staff, gave raises to Mia and Marcus, and even brought on a few new chefs who had been in the same position she'd once been, struggling but full of potential. Her trucks weren't just feeding people, they were providing opportunities for others who had been overlooked, giving them a chance to succeed. Clara knew what it was like to be on the edge, to wonder if your dream would ever come true, and she wanted to make sure no one else had to feel that way if she could help it. As the business grew, so did Clara's recognition in the local food industry. She was invited to speak at events, to share her story of how a small food truck had turned into a thriving enterprise. People wanted to know how she had done it, how she had fought back against a system that had tried to push her aside. Clara spoke with pride about her journey, but she never forgot where it had started, with a single meal given to a struggling culinary student. One afternoon, Clara found herself standing in front of her first truck, the one that had started it all. It was parked in the same spot it had always been, but now, it was surrounded by a fleet of shiny new trucks, each one bustling with activity. She ran her fingers along the edge of the counter, her heart swelling with pride. This truck had been her lifeline once, and now, it was part of something bigger than she had ever imagined. And it all came full circle, because of one act of kindness, because she hadn't let herself give up when things got tough. Luke appeared beside her, his familiar presence grounding her. "Look at what you've built," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've come a long way." Clara smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you've found your place in the world. "We've come a long way," she corrected gently. Luke grinned, his eyes twinkling. "I'm just glad I got to be a part of it." Clara looked out over the trucks, the bustling customers, the team of chefs who had become her family. The future stretched out before her, bright and full of possibility. For the first time in years, she wasn't worried about what was next. She knew, deep down, that whatever came, she was ready for it. And so, with the city at her feet and her business thriving, Clara Dawson, the once struggling chef, finally let herself dream even bigger.